So I'm going to go ahead and get started. Welcome everyone to this webinar, Where Are Your Taxes Going? Part of our Tax Day series. I'd like to thank Yanira Arias, our campaigns manager who put together this webinar. Yanira is on an airplane right now, headed out to Detention Watch Network meetings, so she's not able to be here to facilitate, but we really do appreciate her leadership on this issue. And so just to give us a little bit of a framing as we move forward, as I said, Alianza Americas is an organization of Latin American immigrant-led, it's a network of Latin American immigrant-led organizations. We operate in 13 states. We have about 50 organizational members representing about 150,000 families. And we know that all of us pay taxes, whether we are born in the United States or born somewhere else. If you bring home a paycheck, you pay taxes. If you go to the grocery store, you pay taxes. If you buy anything anywhere, you pay taxes. If you have a house, you pay taxes. So we're all part of the tax-paying public. And it's important for us all to understand how that system works. What are the structural inequalities built into that system, and what we can all do about it to make it different. So we have invited to be with us today Emmanuel Nieves, who's a senior policy manager from Prosperity Now. And Emmanuel is going to talk to us a bit about how the tax code, the Jobs Act, what been the implications of the recent so-called reforms to the tax code, and why we should care about what a regressive tax code does to our society as a whole and how it impacts inequality. And then we're going to turn to Real O'Malley, who's the Director of Education at United for a Fair Economy. And Real is going to talk to us a bit about how budget and tax policy has been used by the elite to accumulate wealth and power, and how megacorporations and the super rich have been able to leverage tax policy to their benefit, and to the ultimate implication of deepening inequality. Finally, we're going to turn to Daniela Burgi Palomino, who's a senior associate for Mexico, migrant rights and border issues at the Latin American Working Group. And she's going to get to the question of where does some of the money go, particularly where is our tax money going in U.S. foreign policy, and what's going on with the budgeting process in fiscal year 2018 and 2019, how that connects to human rights and forced migration in Mexico and Central America. So without further ado, I would like to invite Emmanuel to enable his microphone. Oh, I'm sorry. I was to also tell you that we will have each panelist will speak for a brief intro, no more than 10 minutes. Then I may ask them some questions. And then we will go to a question and answer. If you have a question, please do put it into either the chat box or the Q&A box on your screen. If we have a small enough group, I'll try to enable the microphone so people can ask your question out loud. So you can also raise your hand, but it'd be very helpful if you have questions while people are talking to just type them in as you have them into the Q&A, and we'll make sure that everybody's questions get answered. I'm Amy Shannon. I'm a senior advisor to Alianza Americas, filling in today for Oscar Chacon, who had to take another urgent meeting in New York. So please go ahead then, Emmanuel, and get us started with this tax webinar.
Sure. Thank you, Amy, and hi, everyone. It's great to join you all for this conversation. So I think I have a couple of things to kind of walk through on the recently enacted tax reform piece. One of those, I think, is just before we dive in, just to give a sense of how, the last time that we, as a country, went through an extensive process to reform our tax code was in the mid-'80s. And so for the better part of 30 some odd years, we've been dealing with the same tax code. Obviously, there have been changes over that time, but there hasn't been kind of a structural reform or a change like we've experienced recently. And so, starting next year, we will all be filing under this new tax code made possible, as Amy mentioned, around this Jobs Act, the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act of 2017, that will not only make the already historic levels of inequality we're facing worse, but also further fuel an ever-growing racial wealth gap. And so, what should we and should everyone on this call expect with this new law? Well, I think that depends really on how much you earn and at what point in time we're talking about over the next several years and decades. But thinking about next year, if you're earning about $730,000, putting you among the top 1%, then you're looking at an average tax cut of about $50,000. If you're in the top 0.1%, earning at least $3.4 million, then you're looking at an average tax cut of about $193,000. That said, if you're earning a middle-class income between $48,000 and $86,000 a year, you're looking at an average tax cut of about $800. And now, for those who are earning $25,000 or less, we're talking about some of our most vulnerable individuals and families. The average tax cut that this bill would provide that group is just $60. In all, next year, the top 1% is set to receive a larger share of the tax benefits from this bill, as a larger share from this bill as the bottom 60% of Americans would, including, bottom 60% of Americans, including those in the middle class, something that was really emphasized throughout this debate, combined. By 2025, the top 1% would see their share of the benefits from this bill increase by about 5 percentage points beyond what we're talking about next year, which is about 20%. So by then, about 25%, while the bottom 60% of Americans would see their benefit from this bill go up by 1 percentage point. Unfortunately, the inequities brought about by this bill aren't new or unique to this particular moment in our history of tax policy. For well over 3 decades, these kind of inequities have been defining features of our tax code, and because of that, and because of the level of resources that flow from our tax code each year, our tax code has been at the heart of growing economic and wealth inequality in the U.S. By and large, our tax code is the single largest tool that the federal government uses to help families build lifelong wealth. And so every year, the government spends billions of dollars through tax subsidies and tax breaks to help families buy a home, attend college, and save for retirement. In fact, last year, 2017, the government spent about $730 billion through tax code to help families build wealth through these activities. And so just to put that in perspective for a moment, that amount there is larger, with the exception of the Department of Defense. That amount that I had just mentioned is more money than the budgets of all other cabinet level agencies combined. And yet, from this enormous investment in wealth building tax programs, a millionaire last year received an average tax benefit of about $160,000, while a working family earning about $50,000 received just $226 from the tax code and from these programs in particular. One thing I think to emphasize here before I get into its implications on the racial wealth gap is that when most think about government spending, they don't think about taxes. But the reality is that tax expenditures in the form of deductions and credits is another form of government spending, albeit one in disguise. But by giving up revenue that would otherwise be collected to encourage families to buy a home, obtain a higher education, save for a comfortable retirement, allow for the space to make investments, the government is in effect spending to help families build wealth and long-term economic security. Unfortunately, by helping already wealthy families build more wealth, instead of supporting those who need the support to build up their wealth and their economic security, our tax code has been long investing in economic inequality, and this Tax Cuts and Jobs Act essentially doubles down on the already upside down nature of our tax code. In addition to that, this tax bill not only, in addition to helping those at the top keep more of their money, this bill would also make the racial wealth gap worse, as the law disproportionately benefits white households, especially those at the top, leaving low wealth communities of color behind. For example, we did some quick analysis when the bill was going through debate, and we found that while non-white Hispanics account for about 62% of the population, they make up about 80% of those in the richest 1% and 0.1%. On the flip side, African Americans and Latinos, which account for about 30% of the population, would make up about 3 and 5% of those in the top 1%. And at the same time, looking at the other side of the income spectrum, this dynamic of kind of overrepresentation is true for Black and Latino households, as they are overly represented amongst the poorest 1/5 of Americans. And so what does this have to do with the tax code? What does the racial wealth gap have to do with the tax code? And why should we care about all of this in the context of the racial wealth gap? Well, first, this law essentially creates a massive transfer of wealth from those at the bottom to the top. Second, and more importantly, households of color, particularly Black and Latino households, cannot afford to lose what little wealth they own today. Today, when you take out the family car and other durable goods, Black and Latino households own about $3,400 and $6,300 in wealth, respectively, which is just a fraction of the $140,000 in wealth owned by white households, even when you remove those assets that I had mentioned. And so, given the fact that data that we've looked at and research that we've published, looking at trends over the last 33 years, paints a picture in which, this gap will never come close to being bridged, even as the shift to a majority nation takes hold, or the fact that it would take median Black and Latino households a respective 94 and 242 years of wealth building at the levels that they've experienced in the last 3 years to catch up to white wealth, the amount of white wealth owned today. We can't afford a tax code like the one that has been created by the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. And so I think, just to conclude here, rather than siphoning off what little wealth, low wealth communities and other communities who have low wealth as well, low wealth communities of color, but also white communities with low wealth. We really need tax policy and the tax code that is fair, equitable, and providing the supports to build wealth and build long-term economic security of those who need it the most. It's only been 5 months after this law has been enacted, and so it's fairly new, and the ink, I think, is barely dried on this, and there's a lot of things that are being figured out in terms of the implementation. But the time to act, to repeal, to reform, to improve is now. To achieve the kind of large-scale systems change that families, and particularly families of color and children of color, need to get ahead rather than just getting by, requires dedicated advocates like the folks on this call to educating themselves and others about what this tax bill means for them and for their communities. But beyond that, we need advocates like yourselves to engage policymakers and calling on them to create a kind of a truly equitable tax code, one that's much more equitable and fair than what we ended up with, over the span of 2 months of debate. So those are my kind of general points there. So I'll pass it back to you, Amy. Amy?
I may be having some internet problems. I'm having a hard time. I'm not sure if it's me or if anyone else is having that. Can you hear me, Emmanuel?
I can hear you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay. So had you finished?
Yes, just finished.
Okay. Great. Okay. Thanks. So I think we'll circle back to you actually on this question of because I think important for us. And then I always see some. Okay. And I hear that we're starting to get some questions in, which is great. Please keep them coming. So let's then pass it to Rael, who will keep us moving forward here with the agenda. Thank you, Rael. Floor is yours. Rael, you can go ahead. Thanks.
All right. So thank you, Amy, and thanks for everyone for taking the time to join us for the conversation. Thanks, Emmanuel, for that overview. That was excellent. So my name is Rael O'Malley, and I am Education Director for United for a Fair Economy based in Boston, and we work nationally with movement groups. We're proud members of Alianza Americas, and I happen to be have the honor of serving on the board of Alianza Americas. So I want to talk a little bit about the tax system as it is and the tax system as it should be. And when we talk about taxes and budget, we often don't think about the sorts of things that we pool together to provide for ourselves and our families. So thinking about taxes, we should be thinking about education, health and safety system, highways, and those sorts of things that we rely on every day to provide for ourselves and our families. So I'm going to tell a little bit of a story about the tax system as it should be, and some of the things that it provides for us or should provide for us before getting into how we got to where we are today, which is a tax system and an economy that's designed by the corporate elite that puts up barriers to prosperity for working people, and particularly people of color. So I'm going to tell a little story that we tell sometimes in our trainings about economic inequality. And the story, we call it the Tip O'Neill story, and that's because it's named after a U.S. congressman from Massachusetts that served the late 80s, early 70s. It's a bit of a dated reference, but bear with me. And Tip apparently loved to tell this story, and the story goes something like this. So one of Tip's constituents woke up one morning and turned on the radio to listen to the weather report provided by the National Weather Service. He heard a snowplow go by clearing the street. He made a cup of coffee with clean water thanks to the Clean Water Act. He also cooked up some eggs and bacon for his family, food products that were certified by the USDA. He didn't worry for a moment that his family might be poisoned. He kissed his children goodbye as they waited for the school bus to take them to the local public elementary school and high school. His oldest daughter wanted to go to college and was applying for financial aid and student loans. So on his walk to the subway, he dropped her application letters in the mailbox. He passed the senior housing building where his dear mother lived. He didn't worry for a second about his mother, who had quality health care paid for by Medicare, a monthly Social Security check, and a secure, warm community to live in. He took the subway to the airport. Half of the cost of his ride was subsidized by state and federal transportation funds. And then he flew to Washington on a plane inspected by the Federal Aviation Agency inspectors. On his way to the Capitol, he stopped for an hour at the free admission of the Smithsonian Museum of History. Then he went to his meeting with Congressman O'Neill, and he burst into his office complaining, "I never get anything with my tax dollars." So after telling a story like this, we like to ask for our participants, what strikes you about this story? And oftentimes people will say, I never really realized that my taxes were paying for all of these things that I use every day. So that's a bit of a story about the tax system as it should be and what some of our taxes provide for in terms of our collective needs and necessities. And we know, as Emmanuel began to describe for us, that our current tax system is rigged by the corporate elite so that they don't pay their fair share. And they are able to do that and have the rest of us, working people, pick up the tab. And then beyond that, the greedy few tell us to blame working families, and they tell us to blame immigrants and people of color for our budget and economic and anxieties while sucking trillions from the economy themselves through corporate welfare. So how do they do that? How has it gotten to this point of an economy that's really rigged by the corporate elite? So taxes have been a critical piece of their strategy that have brought us to this point of huge economic inequality that I'm sure many of you are familiar with and have heard about. So they've designed a system that that limits prosperity for working families. And they've done that through a strategy. And I'm going to describe just 3 parts of that strategy. One piece of the strategy is that the greedy few have rigged our democracy by using money in politics. So they pay for campaigns in exchange for political favors. So I'm just going to show you a graph briefly. So this describes what has happened over the past 35 years, a little more, to political expenditures. So these are donations to particular campaigns. And what we've seen is that it has increased enormously over the past few decades. And actually, if we were to extend this graph a little further, we would say it extend to 300 million. So this is definitely increased since the Citizens United decision by the Supreme Court in 2010 that some might be familiar with. So they rig our democracy through the corporate elite rig our democracy through money and politics, and then they do that in exchange for political favors, such as cutting their own taxes. So here's another graph that describes how much individuals are expected to pay towards this this idea of the collective good versus how much we expect from corporations. So what we see is in 1962, corporations paid 21%, individuals 77%. But what we have today, as predicted in light of the Trump tax cuts, is that individuals will be paying 84%. So that's an increase, and corporations will be paying only 7%. So these are 2 parts of the strategy: money in politics and tax cuts. So once the corporate elite are successful in passing these tax cuts, then the 1% moves in with another set of prescriptions. And those prescriptions involve deregulation and privatization. So this allows them to make massive profits off of working people's economic hardship, in particular people of color. So when they remove regulations, they can practice things like predatory lending and discriminatory lending practices. Wall Street can use private equity and hedge funds to buy up companies and lower wages and lay off workers. They can buy up public utilities, making water more unsafe and more costly to acquire for the people who need it most. They set up prisons, private prisons, and detention centers to make profit off of separating families and locking up Black folks and Latinos. And really the list goes on. So we have another version of the Chip O'Neill story where the constituent wakes up and the plow missed their street again. And they went to drink water out of the tap and it wasn't safe to drink. And they got a bill which was higher than it was before because a private equity company bought their water supply. So these are some of the realities that perhaps some of you are familiar with, that you have seen or that you have heard of. And this is what represents an economy and tax system that's rigged by the 1%, and the consequences of which are felt much more deeply by communities of color and low-income communities. So when working families start to feel this economic hardship resulting from this ugly cycle, this strategy that I've just described, the corporate politicians then use something called dog whistle politics to distract us and divide us. So dog whistle, a literal dog whistle cannot be heard by human ears. It's a metaphor in this context, and it means the coded messages that carefully manipulate hostility towards people of color. So for example, when politicians will talk about immigrants taking our jobs or taking jobs from hardworking Americans, it's a dog whistle because they don't explicitly say race, but it's very much implied and understood. They want us to blame Latinos for general economic hardship, for economic inequality, rather than pointing to those truly responsible, the corporate elite. So it actually is possible to have a more equitable tax system. And we know that because we can look at US history and find evidence of it. In the 1950s, the effective top tax rate was 80%. It was an 80% tax rate for incomes above $400,000. In today's dollars, that would be income above $3 million. So above $3 million, any income earned beyond that, folks paid 80%, an average of 80% over the 1950s. So this high rate only affected the top 1%, and the effective rate for the median family during the 1950s was only between 5 and 10%. So we need an equitable tax system that budgets for all our needs, including education, health and safety systems, transportation, rather than dedicating it to separating families through mass incarceration and deportation. So thank you for our time, and I look forward to our discussion later.
Thank you, Rael. And I think we're starting to get some very interesting comments, including some reaction to that story. In that, many of those things that you mentioned that 20 years ago, Tip O'Neill's constituent was getting, we're not getting anymore at the levels that we were. So it's not only that we're paying more, but we're getting less, which is something we'll come back around to when we come back to the Q&A. But thank you. I think that was really, really helpful to just give us a bit of a more on the very practical story-based understanding of how some of this complexity works. So let's turn to Daniela, who's now going to talk to us a little bit about so if we're spending less of our money on these public goods that we can all use, what are we spending our money on, and how is what are the implications for Central America and Mexico?
Sure, thanks, Amy. Let me just see if I'm sharing. Okay. I think we're good. Sorry about that. Well, thank you, Amy, for the introduction, and thanks so much to Alianza Americas for hosting this very important and timely webinar. As Amy said, I'm Daniela Berkey Palomino, and I'm the Senior Associate for Mexico Migrant Rights and Border Issues at the Latin America Working Group. And we're very pleased to join this discussion because I'm going to shift the focus a little bit here on this webinar from domestic issues to transnational and regional impacts of where our funding is going. And this conversation is important because as we talk about where our taxes are going, who's deciding where the money goes, what impact it has on human rights and transnational communities here in the US and in the region, and what we can do about it in the fall. I think as US taxpayers, we also have a responsibility to question and monitor and look to see what kinds of foreign assistance and foreign policy our government is supporting in the region. I'm going to be talking specifically about Latin America, in particular Mexico and Central America. And to see that the foreign assistance that our government is supporting doesn't further exacerbate increased levels of forced displacement and migration, or militarization, which will lead to displacement and migration. So I'm going to break this down a little bit in my presentation today by basically talking about kind of where we stand in the US foreign policy context regarding foreign policy towards Latin America under a Trump administration, what we've seen approved in the levels of funding under fiscal year 18 to Mexico and Central America and what implications that has, what's being proposed for fiscal year 2019, and finally what we can do about that in the next couple of months in our advocacy with our elected representatives to make sure that the kinds of foreign assistance that the U.S. does support abroad reflects our values and interests. So I'm going to end with basically, how do we advocate for rights-based foreign assistance to Mexico and Central America? For those of you who don't know my organization, the Latin America Working Group, we are a coalition of over 60 solidarity, immigrant rights, labor rights, human rights, environmental organizations, of which Alianza Americas forms a part of. I'm very glad to work with them on these issues. And for the past over 30 years, we've been working to promote exactly the kinds of policies that I'm going to be talking about today, which is U.S. policies towards Latin America and the Caribbean that promote human rights, peace, and social justice. And the kinds of material and information that I'm sharing today is part of the ongoing educational work that we do with partners in the U.S. and in Latin America. And then, of course, advocacy, mobilizing grassroots at key moments through action alerts, news, and information on the ongoing human rights situation in Latin America. And then making sure that we get to our elected representatives, to Congress and the administration, increasingly difficult these days, but to really push the kinds of policies that we want to see abroad and that will support our communities and not be hurtful and harmful to them. So what exactly, in what context are we working in currently? So as you can imagine, we're working in an America First foreign policy context. Foreign policy hasn't been a particular strength of this administration, or one that it's really touted as much, of course, as all of its anti-immigrant and anti-refugee vision. And basically, you know, the broader context is that this administration, for its foreign policy, has prioritized sort of counterterrorism, counter-narcotics, and the promotion of U.S. business and trade abroad. So that's kind of the broader context that we're working in. For Latin America, what this has meant really is sort of a focus on immigration, drugs, thugs, and borders, what we like to call it at LOG. And I'm not going to go into all of the anti-immigrant and anti-refugee vision and attacks and policies that we've seen under this administration, from, you know, the increased levels of apprehensions here in the U.S. to focus on building up our deportation forces, immigration enforcement agents, to turning away asylum seekers, mostly from Mexico and Central America at our borders, and to terminating longstanding programs of protection, such as for the DACA beneficiaries and temporary protected status beneficiaries, members of our communities that have transnational families. All these policies, of course, are having an effect not only in the US, but transnationally in Mexico and Central America. And this is what the administration has really prioritized, I think, for Latin America, is, you know, a focus on immigration, a focus on criminalizing communities, Latino communities here, and also their families in the region, and, you know, kind of linking them only to organized crime and to gang members. We're very concerned, obviously, with this scenario and with the potential to sideline human rights even more, with the entry of new Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, National Security Advisor John Bolton, and soon to be, unfortunately, confirmed CIA Director Gina Haspel, all of which will have an influential role in deciding what direction our foreign policy and funding is going to take in the region and abroad, of course. And unfortunately, their trajectory is one that has not been that has not favored human rights by any means. And in fact, they have supported anti-refugee, anti-women's rights, anti-LGBT, have supported and covered up incidents of torture, and have advocated for efforts of military intervention in the region, all of which, of course, we're opposed to. So it's within this context, it's even more important than ever that we really monitor closely where U.S. funding and policy is going abroad, because as we know, and not going to get into the historical perspective here, but we all know the history that U.S. policy has already had in supporting militarization in Mexico and Central America. That has led to flows of displacement, migration. All of our families have ended up in the United States in the past, and we don't want to see a return to that overarching emphasis on counter-narcotics and militarization. So where exactly are we at in terms of what has been approved under fiscal year 18, the omnibus package that was passed just a couple of months ago, because we've been under a delayed schedule. So under that, what we saw for FY18 approved funding was about $615 million in aid to Central America. When I say Central America, I forgot to mention, I'm mostly referencing the Northern Triangle countries of Central America, or Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador together. This is slightly less than what had been approved since 2014. Since last year, which was $655 million. But it did include some human rights conditions, which I'm going to explain a little bit further on, which basically are checks on making sure that before the governments receive funding from the US, they meet a certain series of conditions and demonstrate progress on moving forward, advancing human rights, such as protecting human rights defenders and moving forward in anti-corruption measures. From Mexico, similarly, we saw similar levels in assistance compared to what we had seen in previous years. And thankfully, that assistance package of $152 million also included human rights conditions on a small percentage of the funding that goes to the Mexican military. And I'll talk about a little bit about that later on. But the important, I think, here to note is that the levels, although I've been talking about this concerning rhetoric towards the region, so far in terms of what's been approved, has, in terms of assistance to Mexico and Central America, has been similar to previous years. This, of course, basically demonstrates that Congress was really crucial here in kind of blocking the president's proposed budget in cutting assistance to the region. And I'm going to talk about why that's even important for the next year as well. Here, I'm only talking about foreign assistance that goes through the State Department. I'm not talking about assistance that goes through the Department of Defense, which also has been of concern to us and which is much less transparent and harder for advocates to track. Also important to note, and I don't have the figures for this year, but for FY18, there was an increase, although not as much as the president wanted, in the levels of funding that were approved for the Department of Homeland Security, basically for ramping up border security and the sort of deportation forces and immigration enforcement that have been crucial in implementing the president's anti-immigrant agenda. And that, of course, has also had an impact and will have an impact on the region. But here I'm talking a little bit specifically about foreign assistance. So for FY19, what has the president proposed in terms of foreign assistance to the region? Well, interestingly, he's proposed the same thing that he proposed in FY18, which was then sort of blocked by Congress. And basically what he's proposed is cuts to foreign assistance across the board. To Latin America, he's proposed cuts ranging in 37% across the board to Latin American countries, including on development assistance. Also, interestingly, he's also proposed cuts to foreign military finance funding and also to counter narcotics assistance, which seems strange given that that's a priority of the administration. But I think here, overall, there's less of an emphasis on foreign assistance, no matter kind of the type of foreign assistance it is. There's also been proposed cuts to migration and refugee assistance by 17% globally. This is extremely concerning given the types of refugee crises that we're seeing in the region. And I say crises for Latin America because there is an ongoing refugee crisis in Venezuela. And also, obviously, from the Northern Triangle countries of Central America, where conditions of violence, corruption, and impunity have not decreased over the last few years. And we've seen that with the levels of migrants and increasingly asylum seekers that are continuing to seek asylum, not only in the United States, but also in neighboring countries such as Mexico. This picture actually is from Mexico's southern border just 2 years ago on a recent visit that I took there, which has been a consistent sort of transit point for migrants from the region. And the president also proposed a zeroing out of the Inter-American Foundation, which is a sort of small foundation that has supported community development efforts in the region. And that's been very important to civil society organizations there. So this, kind of demonstrates just, I think, priorities in terms of foreign policy and efforts to support also international organizations. The Migration and Refugee Assistance, for example, supports the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, which has been crucial, of course, in responding and working together with civil society in the region to respond to refugee crisis. So again, this is similar to what we had seen proposed in his FY18 budget, of which a lot of which, thankfully, Congress was able to block with some of, passing similar levels of assistance to what had been passed in the past. And so we are currently at a very crucial moment to make sure and to advocate for the kinds of foreign assistance that we would like to see for the fiscal year 19 budget. So what is it exactly that we as LOG have advocated on together with others? And it's very important within, kind of the human rights situation and the refugee and migrant rights situation going on in the region, that we do support, the U.S. is able to support assistance that will support marginalized communities, and particularly migrants and refugees, sorts of displacement that we're seeing in the region. And I'm not going to go through this list, but I think it's just important to kind of highlight a few key pieces of this, which are basically human rights, humanitarian, small-scale economic development, community-based, support, strengthening judicial systems, supporting international organizations that are able to work with governments to address anti-corruption. So you sort of get the message here of the kinds of assistance that we should be supporting and that will be helpful in promoting human rights in the region. We certainly don't want to make sure that U.S. assistance goes towards increasing militarization to supporting military and security forces that have been abusive in the region. This is an image currently from a campaign that we have to make sure that U.S. assistance doesn't go to fuel violence and abuse in Mexico. And we're also calling currently for suspension of U.S. military aid to Honduras because of the levels of violence that we've seen there and the sort of complete impunity that the security forces have acted upon, which they are, particularly in the last 3 months after a fraudulent election. And we also don't want to see U.S. assistance, of course, going to supporting abusive border enforcement agents throughout the region that will deter migrants and refugees who are seeking protection, as well as a sort of transnational a model of trade and corporations that have been harmful to communities in the region and that violate their rights to their own development. We, as I said, are a very key moment, and I'm just going to end with this, with some key targets for our appropriations advocacy within the next couple of months. key committees that you can target, which include the House Appropriations and Senate Appropriations committees. And those two committees have subcommittees that are specifically focused on state and foreign operations, the sort of budget, foreign assistance budget that I referenced. Our fiscal year, and those committees are in charge of pushing back on the president's proposed budget and really deciding what gets funded abroad, and also kind of holding funding when we want them to withhold funding to abusive security forces, etc. So those committees are really key. June to August are really key months for advocacy because our budget needs to be decided for next fiscal year sometime between October and December of this year, because the budget runs out at the end of September. Our budget, fiscal year runs from October 1st through September 30th. And so the summer months are going to be really crucial. We know there's a lot of work going on for the elections, but they're going to be really crucial to speak out, not only about, where our taxes are going here at home, but also where we want them to go abroad, and to make sure they support human rights and are responsive to forced displacement and migration in the region. So there's some examples of actions that you can take at home or whether in Washington. And with that, I think I've gone a little bit too long, but I'll look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thanks, Daniela, and thank you so much for looping us back around to the question of what can we do? Which is exactly where I wanted us to get to. I think that's important. So Daniela has given us some very specific ideas about where we can go, what we can do on the appropriation side and what the timing of that is. I wanted to come back to Emmanuel with a question that came in from the very beginning. Well, first of all, somebody, I think Beverly, who's on the line with us, said that she was shocked that this 25,000 earners at 25,000 or less were only getting a $60 savings, and wanted to just make sure that that was the correct figure. But then she went on to say, okay, the wealthy don't want to move to a more proportional fair share basis of the tax system, but there's more of us than there are of them. So what can we do to try to move the needle in that direction? So Emmanuel, if you want to weigh in on that, and then I also have a question for Rial, and we'll just give each one of the panelists a question and an opportunity to comment.
Sure. Thank you, Amy, and thank you for the question. Yes, so the figure that I had cited around those earning $25,000 or less getting an average tax cut from this bill, an average benefit collectively of about $60 is correct. That's a figure not produced by ourselves, but one produced by the nonpartisan Tax Policy Center, the Irving Brookings Tax Policy Center. And obviously, with taxes, each case will depend on a family or a individual's personal financial circumstance. And given the dollars that we're talking about here, many of these families are likely to interact and benefit from credits like the EITC, the Earned Income Tax Credit. So, their refund, their benefit might be much higher. But on average, this is kind of the general number, but for everyone, it will depend on your personal financial circumstance. And I think the thing to walk away from there is that, we're talking about if the goal of some of our policies, and if we're to believe what we hear on Capitol Hill and things like that our policymakers do care about those who are most vulnerable, the poor, the disabled. To see a tax bill provide benefits in such a skewed way really kind of goes against that rhetoric and those messages. And so I think it should shock folks and should really kind of rile us up and get us motivated to take action on this, because it's not right and it's not fair in a country like this to have disparities at the levels that we have them now, and to then continue to add on to those through this tax bill, through some of the other pieces that have been discussed here, which will just maintain the status quo. But the second question on what can be done, to reiterate taxes, I think I saw it in a comment in the Q&A box here, but taxes are complicated. It is an issue that generally goes above many of our heads and tends to be in our minds and in our thoughts, from January through April 15th, or at whatever point you might do your taxes and get your refund. Sometimes, like the last year, we had a lot of debate and a lot of excitement, enthusiasm around taxes because there was such a big regressive bill happening. But I think the one thing that folks can do is continue to educate themselves and try to explain to others what they know about this bill. But on a more practical, maybe easier level, is get engaged locally. If you can't come to DC and meet with your policymakers, know that they come home every weekend. So they're usually in town when they are here in DC Monday to Thursday. Typically, they're on a plane Friday, if not Thursday evening, and they're at home, ideally, hosting town halls and meeting with constituents and getting a sense of what's happening on the ground to inform their work. And those are the moments that you can interact with them and tell them how you feel about this tax bill, what benefits, if you're getting any from them, or what benefits you'd like to get from them. I think Speaker Paul Ryan made an error now of elevating the benefits that this tax bill provided as Secretary in Pennsylvania, which is about $1.50 extra in her paycheck. Take a note of that. Check your paycheck. If you haven't seen the bump that they continue to kind of talk about, then tell that to your policymakers. Tell them that this is right. And the other thing I will note for you as well, regardless of the benefits that this bill does and provides to folks on the individual side, however skewed they might be, they're not permanent. They're actually temporary, and in effect, they're set to expire in 10 years. And at that point, whatever benefits you might have been getting from this bill are going to become a tax hike. And so, to Rial's point, that didn't happen on the corporate side. The corporate side, actually, those reforms are permanent. That is for life, unless something, happens on Capitol Hill. But that's another way to kind of emphasize that this is not fair, that we're not being treated equally, that these businesses are getting a lot of money from this tax bill, and they may be given bonuses, but at the same time, they're cutting jobs. They're not investing back in the community. So it's really kind of engaging your policymaker wherever you might be able to, including online, social media, email, phone calls, things like that.
Thank you. And somebody in the chat.
Amy, I think I might have lost you.
Yeah, you're cutting out, Amy.
Well, I'm going to go ahead and take a leap and guess that Amy, being familiar with United for a Fair Economy's work, was going to toss me the question about what can we do to educate our communities and how can we have these conversations. We only have a few minutes left. So I'm just reading the chat box. I really appreciate people's contributions and conversations. And I think it's critical to open up spaces for dialogue. There's growing awareness about economic inequality, thanks to the Occupy movement and movements for economic justice, working people's movements. Do we have Amy back now?
And Sorry about that, Rial. Go ahead. I was about to call on you, so you just.
All right. I took the leap.
Excellent.
Yeah. All right. Thanks. And there is growing awareness of structural racism and racial inequality, thanks to movements such as Black Lives Matter, the Movement for Black Lives, movements like Alianza Americas that have taken critical action to take on the militarization, deportation, and we feel, along with many others, that these are very much part of the same conversation, that we can't talk about economic inequality without talking about racial inequality. So a key part of educating our communities is having a conversation about how we got here, how we got to this place of massive inequality between the 0.01% and the rest of us, and massive inequality between white families and Black and Latino families. And thinking about looking at the structures and policies that are in place currently and that have existed through the history of the United States that have created these inequalities. Because if we are going to undo these systems, we need to understand how it is we got here. So quick plug, we have a number of curricula and resources on faireconomy.org. If you're interested in facilitating conversations or learning more about facilitating conversations about economic and racial inequality, please visit our website at faireconomy.org. Thanks again so much.
Thanks, Rael. And I would just also emphasize for anyone that's interested that the UFE, the United for a Fair Economy team, is very bilingual. So there's, I know, plenty of opportunities to do many of these things in Spanish as well. And I wanted to also then just circle back to a comment that was made, and maybe Daniela would like to respond, about not using language that is really co-opted by the sort of, when you talked about less securitization, or how do we avoid mirroring the language of the administration or of those who would seek to drive a narrative around what we should be spending money on, as opposed to some of the language that we want to use, which I know actually LOG is actually very good about trying to put forward a narrative around community and sort of human rights focused. And I don't know if Daniela, if you wanted to respond at all to that, about how do we be careful with language in order to make sure we're driving the narrative?
Sure. Sorry, Amy, having some technology issues. Yeah, no, I think it's a really good point, and I'm really thankful to Sandra for sharing that comment. I think we have seen a complete co-opting by the administration of, you know, who our communities are, both here in the U.S. and abroad. Linking them to criminals that then, of course, are in need of the strong hand security policies to respond to gangs here and also in the region. And we've seen, I think, a direct linkage between immigration and foreign policies. So basically kind of advocating for strong hand security, militarized policies here in the US and abroad. We saw that with Attorney General Sessions, for example, visit to El Salvador, where he was, you know, last year pushing the government to do more on addressing gangs with policies, you know, instead of looking at sort of holistic community-based violence prevention policies, kind of pushing the government to do more on policies that will, you know, only exacerbate migration, displacement, and kind of take the wrong approach to violence. And we've seen the same kind of focus with criminalizing asylum seekers and painting them as wanting to take advantage of the immigration system here. So I think there definitely are ways, you know, to not only just not say not this or less that, but really lift up who it is that we're talking about, as you said, in terms of communities, in terms of refugees, in terms of indigenous, Afro-descendant, really kind of, you know, who it is that we're speaking about, and you know, but not necessarily just saying less this or not that, because that only continues to fuel the administration's rhetoric.
Thank you, Daniela, and thank you to all of you for being on this webinar. I think it was a great wrap up, quick but really helpful. And I wanted to just remind everyone that we do have some tax day resources at our website, www.alianzamericas.org. There's also the resources that Rael mentioned from United for a Fair Economy. Much of what we did on our website, we used the excellent resources that our friends at Prosperity Now have developed. So please also look there, and we're happy to put anyone that wants it in touch with those resources. So I would just, with that, I think I would just thank all of our panelists very much for being a part of this webinar, and hope we can continue with this series as we move into the appropriations period this fall. Thank you again, everyone. And with that, we will conclude today's webinar. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks.